Oh, let's check out Volksgeist. Volksgeist has been popping off. I'm very happy.
There's a number out there that's
Volksgeist is kind of based and kind of really been popping off, like really popping off. I saw it today. Very cool, dude. Look at this fucking jump, dude. When it started with the Justin Bieber shit and then moved people into political conversations, blah blah blah. I think he's one of the fucking OG founders of fucking Nebula or something. But I talked to this guy a lot when I was back in the day. He even edited one of my videos, and he's based. Don't worry, he's based. In our definition of based. So let's see. Another white man react. Hey, you don't know what his fucking ethnicity is. He might be. I don't know.
so huge that it doesn't sound
It's a cool, like it's a cool premise.
Real. There's a number out there that's so huge that it doesn't sound real. $6 million. But it is real. It's roughly the total amount of wealth that's now held by just a couple hundred billionaires in America. And these people launch rockets, buy islands.
Oracle CEO and billionaire Larry Ellison just bought the island of Lanai, which is the 6th largest island in Hawaii.
Run surveillance empires.
I feel like that Antichrist would maybe be using the tools that you were building, right?
There are all these different scenarios. I obviously don't think that that's what I'm doing.
And advance at a speed that entire governments can't keep up with.
Do you know who Palantir is?
I do.
And they're sold to us as geniuses, saviors, visionaries.
You're Elon Musk. I am? What an honor to meet you.
But there's a time within living memory that this
Holy shit, that show sucks. What the fuck? That actually happened?
billionaire world did not exist. Only 40 years ago, the richest men in America were expected to shut up, be humble, pay taxes, and maybe put their name on the wing at a hospital. If that. Society wasn't generally that interested in ultra-wealthy people. Because back then, the vast majority of Americans weren't dreaming about millions and billions of dollars. Back then, the dream was stability. A good job, a nice house, a future you could count on. But then a once-in-a-generation handful of geniuses built unimaginably amazing technology, and they got rewarded with previously unimaginable amounts of money.
Ellison's fortune soared, lifting his total fortune to $393 billion US.
But it's not really quite that simple at all. Because they aren't just the richest men on earth, they're also the most hated.
Mr. Zuckerberg, you and the companies before us, you have blood on your hands.
Today, people in my generation and others feel like they're more likely to destroy the world than to save it. And while some people worship them, others want to them.
Mr. Teal, do you have any comments about Palantir's surveillance of the American people, sir?
And so
Yeah, because they want to kill us, bruv.
the mask is off. Billionaires didn't build the future, they designed our downfall. Because at the same time as these massive fortunes grew and took over our public consciousness, the dream of an affordable, comfortable, middle-class life began to die. And so the real question isn't, how did these guys get so rich? It's, how did all of this become possible in the first place? Who's paying the price for it? And what did we give up in exchange to get here? Not long ago, being a billionaire was far less common than it is today, and it certainly didn't carry the same social, cultural, or political weight that it does right now. The Forbes 400 is a list of the 400 richest Americans. They've been publishing this list every year since 1982. And for the most part, when they first started this list, it was basically just a bunch of people who had quietly made a fortune in oil, real estate, or media. 192 of the people on that list were from those three industries alone. This is right at the very start of the Silicon Valley tech boom.
Basically, people that to an extent stumbled into wealth because they were managing a resource that at that point in time was how do I put this? Before it blew up, was not that important, and then only because they were managing it or owning it in this case, they ended up blowing up, literally falling into cash.
Steve Jobs, back then referred to as Stephen Jobs, was only 26 years old and had just recently released the Apple II computer, and he just barely made the list. All in all though, there were less billionaires on the Forbes 400 40 years ago than there are right now in the state of Connecticut alone. That's how incredibly uncommon they were back then. But I think the strangest part of it all, though, is basically how the billionaires, or mostly millionaires actually, reacted to being on the list. It wasn't seen as like a cool thing that you earned. Because just 40 years ago, the very idea of making a list of all the richest people in America was basically considered tasteless and unnecessary. Looking at all this stuff is kind of like looking through a window into a forgotten world. It's unrecognizable. It's like, what happened? How did we get here? And in order to figure out what changed, we need to go all the way back to the late 1800s. Even as far back as the late 1800s, the rapidly increasing pace of industrialization was creating immense wealth. In the 1890s,
Something weird is happening to my connection right now. I have no idea what the fuck it is, but it is what it is.
Carnegie was by far the richest man in the world, having made the equivalent of around $7 billion in today's money after selling his company Carnegie Steel.
Andrew Carnegie, industrialist, philanthropist, and benefactor, was not only one of the pioneers in the rise of American industry, but established the idea of social responsibility for men of wealth.
And while this was before the rise of mass media and social commentary, Andrew Carnegie himself actually wrote essays about how he viewed money that we can read right now. And The Gospel of Wealth, which he wrote in 1889, set the standard for how very extremely rich people should view their own fortunes in this new age of rapidly expanding capitalism. In the essay, he talks about the biggest problem of his age being the proper administration of wealth, discussing how the most important part of being rich is to use the money to create things that benefit the entire world, and not just himself. He ends the essay with a famous line: "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." Carnegie would go on to give away about 90% of his money during the last 30 years of his life. He paid for the building of over 2,500 public libraries around the world, and he also helped Booker T. Washington create the National Negro Business League. In addition to that, he helped provide funding for Tuskegee University in Alabama, he co-founded Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, he paid for Carnegie Hall in New York City. John D. Rockefeller is another famous example of an ultra-wealthy capitalist in the late
and bought private militia to kill striking workers,
late 1800s and the early 1900s. Rockefeller founded the Standard Oil Company, which by 1900
White man's burden mentality of the time was about how Americans were going to develop the world. Yes, that, and also like the capitalists themselves did not understand the inherent hyper-efficiency of just pursuing the profit motive for the sake of the profit motive. They were not as efficient as their later counterparts, which grew into a class that understood that generating higher and higher profits is not directly related to creating quote unquote value. So they weren't as hyper-parasitic, maybe, I don't know. That's a weird argument to make, but still, as they are today because they didn't know how to be. That's it. They were the first guys doing it. It's like the first guy that had a gun. He didn't know how to, immediately develop a minigun and then develop a grenade and then develop a missile. If he had the capability of developing those, he would. But first, he needed to develop the gun.
Controlled 90% of America's oil production. In the 1910s, while oil and gas were becoming increasingly important commodities, his personal wealth came to be about equivalent to 3% of the entire GDP of America, and he became America's first billionaire. Upon retiring, though, he also spent the rest of his life giving his money away. John Rockefeller founded the University of Chicago, and despite controversy, also supported a number of black colleges and churches in the South that were still struggling after the Civil War. Cornelius Vanderbilt, another 1800s capitalist, built a massive fortune in railroads and shipping, and he had a similar story. After retiring, he would repeatedly give some of the largest charitable donations that had ever been given in American history up to that point. But at the same time, the part I didn't mention is that when it came to their legacy, these businessmen's charitable contributions are footnotes compared to how they treated the workers who built their empires. Carnegie built libraries and schools around the country, but he also presided over the 1892 Homestead Strike. When his steelworkers protested a wage cut in the summer of that year, his plant manager Henry Clay Frick hired 300 armed guards to break the union, resulting in a days-long gun battle that left 10 of his steelworkers dead. Both John D. Rockefeller and Vanderbilt have similar stories of deadly work, poor pay, and extreme ruthless ruthless control over their industries. During their lives, they were called robber barons, a translation of the German term Raubritter that referred to medieval feudal lords in Germany who forcibly charged tolls on travelers and merchants passing through their land. Essentially, they were seen as rich people who got that way by stealing from the poor. And from the 1880s to the 1900s, critics would commonly point out that people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt weren't really creators of wealth, but in fact were robber barons. They robbed the public by creating monopolies that crushed competition and allowed them to charge any price they wanted.
And then threw back pennies on the dollar at us by building us some libraries or some shit. And they told us that they are deserving of their wealth. Dude, the monarchs did the same thing. They would take the sons and daughters of their people into fruitless imperial wars, and then they will come back and like build like 500 churches in the last 10 years of their life as a way to buy their way into heaven and elevate themselves to sainthood. Capitalists do the same.
They robbed their workers by paying starvation wages, subjecting them to deadly working conditions, and they were willing to massacre striking workers to break unions. Political commentary and satire at the time would often point out that this prevailing laissez-faire economic system, defined by the completely hands-off approach to business by the government, wasn't actually what it claimed to be. It was actually a sham that the robber barons used to justify their continued existence, because it allowed them to squash competition, all while they kept bribing politicians to allow the corruption to continue. Regardless of the fact, though, that Carnegie got his fortune from working people till they died, he and his peers did set a standard for how extremely wealthy people should act, to not be miserly, to recognize when you have enough money and to give the rest away. Although that gospel of wealth didn't actually solve any of the problems that people were facing at the time. It was really just a moralization of the reality that Carnegie and his friends had built extremely corrupt, dirty fortunes on top of starvation wages, dead workers, and political bribes. Because in the early 1900s, the US was still full of brutal inequality, and its political system had no idea how to manage it. And so by the time a new boom arrived a couple decades later, the robber barons had mostly gotten old and died, and many of their companies had been broken up. But the system that created them was very much still alive. At the start of the 1920s, even though the rest of the Western world had been destroyed by World War I, the United States was totally fine, and thus began the Roaring Twenties. The same laissez-faire, free market, anything-goes philosophy that powered the Gilded Age before returned the aftermath of the war into the most frenzied moment of growth in American history. After World War I, American consumerism went into overdrive. The same factories that had been churning out weapons and uniforms for the war could now make consumer goods easier, cheaper, and faster than ever before.
This slipper is made of the new imported summer shantung embroidered in pastel colors.
They suddenly pivoted to cars, refrigerators, radios, furniture, clothes. In 1920,
they started linking sense of self-value with commodity consumption, which then redefined what American culture is as simply consume, okay? Treats. To consume a treat is to be American. And it made a lot of people rich, but not a lot of people happy, at least happy on the surface, I guess.
Around 60,000 American households had their own radio. By 1928, though, that number would be over 10 million.
We shall now broadcast the election return. We'd appreciate it if anyone hearing this broadcast would
and swap the church with the mall, baby. Swap the church with the mall.
Communicate with us, as we are very anxious to know how far the broadcast is reaching and how it is being received.
Suddenly, there was this sense that everyone, not just the ultra-rich, could buy their way into a modern life. And another huge part of that wasn't just all these new factories, but now consumer debt as well. Buying a car or a radio or new furniture on installment plans stopped being something that only desperate people would do, and it became totally normal middle-class behavior. Borrow now, pay later, enjoy the future today.
To have money is to be virtuous, and to be virtuous is to be ordained by God. Therefore, being wealthy is to have a right to rule. Beautifully put. Completely insane, but beautifully put. Cansada. These photos of workers in the factories depress me so much. Like their whole lives in abysmal conditions, becoming mangled, empty shells. Socialism really is the answer because humans were not meant for this. Yes, and hopefully our great-grandchildren can look upon our era and say that it depresses them and that it looks barbaric and insane, because that will be proof that we have done something in the eternal struggle to make sure that our great-grandkids don't have to struggle the same way we do. That is purpose. That is purpose. The continuation, not only the continuation of the species, but the betterment of the species down long treks of millennia.
And a great number of people did actually begin to thrive. The average American income went up by over 35% as the 1920s wore on. And fundamentally, this was the beginning of modern America as we know it today. The 1920s even marked a fundamental cultural shift. Women gained the right to vote, youth culture became more prominent than ever, movies and radio gave rise to mass media and celebrity culture, nightclubs and jazz concerts boomed. In the Roaring 20s, even the Dow Jones began growing rapidly with no sign of stopping. And it was because the 1920s was also the birthplace of retail investing as we know it as well. With all these new popular consumer goods, there were big corporations making a lot of money, and all these regular people with more disposable income than ever wanted a piece of the pie.
From Boston to San Francisco, market is the national media, the biggest news of the day, every day, coast to coast. And what quotation? Steel up, utilities up, buy on margin. Brokers' loans are available. All you have to do is have 5 cents for a telephone call, and you can even get that on credit. Just buy on margin.
By the late 1920s, over 10% of US households held stocks, which was totally insane and had never happened before. For the first time, business leaders and stock traders became pop culture icons. In big cities, crowds would gather in coffee shops and hotel lobbies to cheer on their favorite company's stock price. And so if you weren't convinced that the 1920s were just like today before, you probably should be by now. But a big part of why any of this was possible was because of margin loans.
300 million shares are being carried on margin. Brokers' loans are at an all-time high.
Guess what happened
September
afterwards?
1929, soaring out into the wild blue yonder, stopped at the high plateau.
But history had other plans. In October of 1929, the entire American stock market lost 89% of its peak value in just a couple of days. Stocks had reached prices that were many multiple times higher than their earnings, with most stocks having quadrupled in value in just 4 years, a rate far higher than their actual growth. And so suddenly, it was all over.
Tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of New York Stock Exchange and market prices.
With all the unprecedented growth, it had been hard to see the forest through the trees. In reality, the American economy was completely unsustainable. Even though Americans were making more money than before, income inequality was rising faster than wages. By 1928, just 1% of the American population was earning 25% of all income in America. On top of that, many Americans were in a lot of debt, and when the stock market crashed, they were unable to continue paying it back. Within 1 year, the unemployment rate in the US was over 25%. About half the banks in America had gone out of business, and the financial crisis had spread to the UK, Germany, Canada, Chile, Italy, and many other countries around the world. The American landscape was quickly covered in hundreds of shantytowns and slums that were built to house the millions of people, around 2% of the entire population, that went homeless as the recession became a years-long depression, an era defined by financial and emotional trauma. It was a disaster. This was the worst financial crisis in the history of the world. America was suffering. But in the aftermath, the entire American ethos changed. Laissez-faire, anything-goes economics were clearly not going to work anymore. And so a new system was built to prevent that level of inequality from ever happening again. President FDR and his allies introduced the New Deal, a series of wide-ranging social, economic, and political reform.
The two videos we watched today are eerily similar. This one's obviously much better, but yeah, a low-key fuck-up on my side, chat.
Designed to reduce poverty, protect workers, and create a more equal economy for everybody.
Settled in the White House, the new president went to work. To do so, he created the famous alphabetical agencies of the New Deal. Their purpose? To fight the Depression, to provide work and security. Soon the factories reopened. Unemployed men returned to their jobs.
Social Security was introduced in an attempt to prevent the child and elder poverty that was widespread at the time.
But we have tried to frame
And to prevent revolution.
a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against
And the New Deal was also responsible for the ending of child labor. Up until the late 1930s, around 1 out of every 5 children in America had a job. They also raised taxes for Americans in the highest bracket of income to
No, the children, they yearn for the mines, they yearn for the mines. Why do you take the child out of the mine?
94.
This is why today they do their little TikTok dances and they're 6'7", 6'7", 6'7". They would not have the time for that if they were in the mine going dig, 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 dig.
percent. And it would stay at 70% or higher for about 45 years. The ethos of this period in American history was pretty clear. In an era of rebuilding the world after economic disaster, the sacrifice would be shared, and no one would accumulate massive wealth unchecked. If you want the full PhD version of this big economic and political shift, there are hundreds of books about post-war economic policy, and I haven't read any of them. I'm not going to pretend to have a full understanding of the New Deal. I know it's controversial, some people want to say it was a mistake, blah, blah, blah. But what I can say is that this was an era when life for the average American changed forever. Economists call the period that came after the Great Depression the Great Compression. The gap between the rich, the middle, and the poor was compressed to its lowest point in modern history. And the very real, measurable result of this Great Compression is that it was also the birth point of the American middle class as we know it. This moment in history, this moment after a horrible disaster and all the changes that needed to be made to prevent it, are exactly why people talk about boomers being able to buy houses for $5,000 and a rusty spoon. Compared to the middle of the 1920s, when the top 1% of America was making over 25% of all income in the country, by 1950, that number would be under 10%. You know how people say that boomers had the world in their hands and that they wasted it, or how they had all these advantages and an easy life, that they lived in a fantasy world? This is why. By the mid-1950s, a factory worker, a teacher, a bus driver, whatever it was, many different people at many income levels were all able to enjoy a higher standard of living than ever before. Whether it was owning a house or a car or planning for retirement or putting money away for their kids' education, all of this was often possible even on one income for the entire household. In 1940, around 40% of American households owned their own home. By 1970, that number would be over 65%. Life for the average American in general was unprecedentedly good. Education, medical technology, economic opportunity, almost every measure of personal or societal success was going up. In 1940, only 15% of young adults enrolled in college. By 1970,
the industrial base was there, the jobs were there, redistribution happened, there was every single mechanism that could be utilized in a market economy to destimulate accrual of capital over a particular level was utilized. Capitalists themselves had not discovered offshoring their capital or offshoring, outsourcing their labor force. All the conditions were there for a sizable, decent livelihood for the majority of the population, right? Not for the majority, for the majority of the white population, which is not, but you get what I mean.
Number was over 40%, and college, often funded by the government, was cheaper than ever before. The average annual in-state tuition and fees for a public university in 1970, $394. $394. Is that even true? And so the middle class, in many ways, wasn't really the middle. This huge new socioeconomic group, in reality, their experience was defined by better living conditions than anyone at any point in history ever. Of course, though, this wasn't a perfect system at all either. The rise of the middle class was also accompanied by insane
Reagan ended up fucking us for that too, yes, but if it wasn't Reagan, it would be somebody else. Because again, of the systemic incentives to eventually take back said reforms, because it makes capitalists at some point understand that the patsies are gonna patsy and that they do not have to placate the masses anymore. This is all of you know this.
Institutionalized racism to the point where large parts of almost every single American city were intentionally bulldozed to destroy black neighborhoods. Both apartment buildings that my grandparents grew up in after coming to America no longer exist because they were knocked down to put in highways that ended up destroying like 3/4 of American cities. And that being, of course, among other insanely racist laws that were written to promote segregation even after it was illegalized. Is illegalized a word, actually? This is crazy. I think a lot of people, Gen Z, my age, like do not know this or maybe heard it one time in school and just forgot. But in most states in America, women couldn't get credit cards, bank accounts, or home loans until 1974. Homosexuality was legally considered a mental illness until 1973. On top of that, the world was insanely polluted. From the 1940s to the 60s, industrial cities like LA, Pittsburgh, and New York were covered in smog for years. In Pittsburgh in 1948, a cloud of smog containing toxic chemicals killed 20.
Every time I see Pittsburgh, I just it reminds me of that Fallout DLC where you fight in pits in Pittsburgh.
People.
Settles down on the industrial town of Donora, Pennsylvania.
Pittsburgh is always gonna just be that for me. A Fallout DLC.
Brings with it mysterious death. The local zinc plant suspected of emitting poison smoke is closed down. But an epidemic of pneumonia is feared in the wake of Donora's deadly plague of smog.
And this isn't in the US, but I did find this while researching the video, that in London in 1952, there was a cloud of toxic smog that covered the entire city and killed 10,000 people in 5 days. And this isn't like something that everyone knows. This is just considered kind of a normal consequence of life back then. Cleveland's Cuyahoga River was so polluted with industrial waste in the 1950s and 60s that it used to occasionally catch fire. It was a river that was so polluted that it would light itself on fire spontaneously. Of course, that's not even to mention the Vietnam War, where trust in the American government reached an all-time low after wealthy, well-connected young men were able to avoid the military draft, while millions of poor and minority kids were sent straight to the front line to experience hell on earth in the Southeast Asian jungle. But the general end result of this era was that from the 1940s up until the 1980s, life in middle-class America was pretty much great. It wasn't perfect at all, but at the very least, it was objectively decent for most people. Maybe you disagree with me, but you can't argue with the fact that it was a huge improvement over the world of starvation, deadly working conditions, child labor, widespread disease, and poverty that had come before. In 1959, Richard Nixon, who was vice president at the time, would brag during a visit to Soviet Moscow that any American factory worker could afford a house filled with modern conveniences. Being middle class became a badge of honor. It was a cultural identity, a statement of values. It was the American way for 90.
Yes, and the only reason that they could afford that is because of the reforms that were enacted thanks to the fear of revolution that the Bolsheviks managed to push through. Always remember that the only time they give you anything, including reforms, is because they're afraid of revolution, because they're afraid of chaos, because they're afraid of an uprising. And every time a well-intentioned reformist talks to you about the golden age of American reform, remind them that ironically, they get to do reforms. They got to do reforms because revolutionary socialists did their fucking job. Okay? Right now, there's not a lot of fucking revolutions happening anywhere. I don't see them reforming, baby. I see them pivoting further and further right, baby. That's what I see. Entrenching power more and more, telling you to fucking suck it because there's no viable alternative on the horizon. So yes, always remind reformists that they managed to do their reforms because revolutionaries managed to do their revolutions.
99% of people, even those who it didn't apply to. Everyone wanted in. Upper class was seen as stuffy.
That's succeeding downwards of every socialist revolutionary, eh? Failing upwards for every reformist.
Pretentious or disconnected. Lower class was even worse. Shows like The Brady Bunch and Leave It to Beaver, then The Cosby Show, Family Ties, Roseanne, then later Malcolm in the Middle. This kind of media and storytelling perpetuated the middle class as the unquestionable norm. In The Goonies, the classic movie from 1985, the whole story only starts because an evil real estate developer wants to bulldoze a working class neighborhood to build a golf course. You could be rich, but you couldn't be too proud of it. The celebrity entrepreneur was not really a thing the way it is now. It was the era of the quiet benefactor, someone who pays to have their name on the cancer wing at a hospital without any of the patients knowing who they were. I remember even as a kid in the late 2000s, there was this kind of joke that everyone was middle class as long as you weren't living in a homeless shelter or driving a Rolls Royce. People would just kind of try to identify as being normal. And so here we are, back to 1982 when Forbes first started publishing its list of the richest 400 Americans. And in the year's first list, America's richest man was Daniel Ludwig, who had made over $1 billion in the shipping industry without ever taking a public interview in his career. Point being though, this stuff simply was not a huge deal in the public consciousness, especially compared to today. I mean, imagine a world where the richest man in America is just this kind of—
which was low-key the point, wasn't it?
Unknown person where you could walk by him on the street and you wouldn't know who he was. Someone who doesn't even give comments to the press, let alone own a social media platform. It's completely foreign. But when you fast forward to 1990, the number of American billionaires had increased exponentially from 13 in 1980 to a total of 66 10 years later. That's a 5 times larger increase than the previous 50 years as a whole. Today, though, that number is over 800. That's 61 times higher than it was just 40 years ago. And in 1980, the 400 list total wealth was $92 billion. In 2021, it was $4,500 billion. Again, having multiplied.
And remember, you don't have to adjust billions to inflation because it's billions. Billions is always an unconscionable amount of money, even when adjusted to, I don't know, 10,000% inflation.
By 50 times in 40 years. So what happened? Prior to the 1980s, computers obviously existed, but their utility was pretty limited. They were refrigerator-sized machines that sat locked away in the back rooms at banks, universities.
Remember, they just became more efficient, chat. Like they became better. Like everything became better. That's why the billionaires got more. You know, it's not them figuring out. Oh Lord.
Cities, airports, and military bases, doing payroll, designing missiles, running airline reservations, or doing calculations for physics experiments. Famously, the computers that guided the Apollo 11 to land on the moon were 100,000 times less powerful than an iPhone 6.
That module contains 512 cores over a half a mile of wire, and it performs the function of storing over 65,000 individual pieces of information.
But they weighed over 70 pounds and cost $1 million per unit to produce. The idea that you'd have one of these to use at home for homework was science fiction. Like, it's literally something from a cartoon. But all of that changed when Intel invented the microprocessor in the early 70s, suddenly making it possible to build super powerful computers that were cheap enough for everyday Americans and small enough to fit on a desk at home. And so a handful of companies started trying to turn the personal computer into an everyday object that everyone would want.
Using an Apple II is very easy. The only hard part is getting your kid away from it. You see, Apples are the leading computers in schools, so even though you want it to help you work at home, your kid will want to use it for his own homework. Of course, if all else fails, there's one last thing you can try. Get him an Apple of his own.
Apple, IBM, Microsoft, Intel, Oracle, these names that feel totally inevitable now were at the time being run by outsiders.
30 years later, 6'7", 6'7".
Pushing a strange new idea. Personal computers in every office, school, business, and home.
Well, we base our theory on the fact that we make personal computers that can be used irrespective of location. And the home just happens to be one of the locations that the computers are used in. So we foresee Apples being used in homes, but we also foresee them being used in businesses and education, and there's an Apple going up on the first space shuttle, as you may know, to control a biology experiment.
And as their companies started to grow exponentially throughout the 80s, these tech founders were not seen as industrial warlords the way that Carnegie and Rockefeller were. The wealth of oil, steel, railroads, and skyscrapers was dirty, heavy, and violent. Early tech founders and their products couldn't have been more different. We're talking—
Oh, they whitewashed the living shit out of it. And they also gave us a pitch that these geeks and nerds are actually going to be much more chill than the, as he said eloquently, billionaire warlords of the past, okay? These are nice guys that care about building the next sci-fi future in which we will all be elevated through technological development. And now they're building drones. They can locate you based on skin color and kill you while you're at your wedding. Yeah. Big mistake there.
About skinny 20-somethings with casual clothes and bad haircuts, promising a tech revolution that would bring about a brighter, better future for everybody.
Jobs was a perfect model of the new manager as coach, cheerleader, and nourisher of champions.
He's a maniac. He's a maniacal genius. His job is to stir up everything. He's a muckraker in the classic sense of the word. He will not leave anything alone. He will not allow inadequacy or compromise to exist.
It's a great machine. It's a step forward in terms of the way it uses graphics and the speed. This is a machine that a lot of people are going to be able to afford. That's a very, very useful machine.
They weren't framed as greedy. They were seen as visionaries, anti-establishment geniuses, hackers, misfits, nerds. And so with the rise of tech, the aesthetics of wealth changed completely. For all of history up until that point, money was kind of ugly. Now it was young, loud, and unpredictable. And
it became beautiful, and it became not only a status symbol, but a badge of honor to be worn by the only celebrity that matters. What is that celebrity? The rich celebrity. And with that, we bring it to a close today, chat. I gotta go do the program shit, but I will see you on Thursday. Thank you, everybody that paid your taxes, my friends. Thank you, everybody that subscribed. Thank you, everybody that followed. If you're here and you haven't pressed the button, what are you waiting for? It literally costs you nothing. Just click that little thing. Thank you to my lovely mods. Join the Discord. Follow me on all the socials. You know how it goes, baby. I will see you on Thursday, and I will see you on Friday, and I will see you on Sunday. That is the schedule, okay? Who should we rate today, though? So many people live right now. So many people live and alive. Live it and live it, okay? Tell me, who do you want rided? Who do you want rided? Who do you want me to ride? Who do you want me to ride? No, not in that way. Who should I read? Central Committee is offline, I believe. We can ride Sean the Black, Hassan, The Surfs, Ray Kai, Northern Lion, Cock Carnage, Argonian Bum. Let's raid Argonian. Fuck yeah, let's raid Argonian. What the fuck? Argonian is a fellow chatter that we deeply, deeply respect. Let's raid Argonian. Absolutely. Everybody, please give every single follow and subscribe to Argonian right now, okay? Right now. And next time, we better gamble, motherfuckers. Next time, we better fucking gamble. Go to Argonian. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Mwah, mwah. What the fuck? No, click the button. God damn it, motherfucker.